I went into Signalis knowing very little about the game. All I knew is that it was a survival horror with a female protagonist in a futuristic setting, and one of my best buddies gave it a high recommendation. So I didn't know what to expect going into this, which I think is the right approach that I would encourage for others. So the very short, spoiler-free overview is basically, if you want Resident Evil and Silent Hill merged together in a far-off future setting with a top-down camera perspective for the gameplay, some fantastic puzzles and level design, and a story that is just way out there. If all this sounds good to you, then yes, I would recommend it. It's actually a good game. It's not perfect, I have more than a few issues with it, but it is by far the best fan-made, classic survival horror-inspired game that I have ever played. After some of the nonsense with Tormented Souls and how abysmally bad Daymare was, Signalis is a legitimately good game that takes the familiar strengths of the genre, but still manages to create something unique to itself. So, like I said, that's the spoiler-free stuff. There will be some spoilers going forward, but I'll keep it light as usual. I wouldn't want to ruin this story for anyone. That being said, honestly, the story is so strange and convoluted that I feel like I barely understand it myself. But here's the general gist of the setting. You play as Elster, and her name is a literal pronunciation of her model number. In the future, androids, known as replicas, are commonplace and used for hard labor, housekeeping, military exercises, and more. After being separated from her human partner, Alina, Elster goes to the mining facility where she works, only to find it overrun with zombie-like androids that have lost their minds and turned violent. Now Elster has to navigate this nightmarish hellhole, find her partner Alina, and escape alive, all the while learning what's happened on the mining facility of Sierpinski. The setting takes place in a far-off future with a communist-like government that rules with an iron fist. You get the usual propaganda posters, and the setting is used to touch on several themes: recognizing one's own identity and sense of self, the value of mass-produced robots in a world devoid of individuality, the weight of self-sacrifice and personal desires. There are some pretty heavy topics here, and they're presented in the most artsy-fartsy way possible. Now, don't get me wrong, I like artsy-fartsy. Omori certainly has its pretentious moments, and Rez is an amazing experience that I wish everyone could play for themselves at some point. But then you have Signalis. This game is so art house, it oozes pretension and self-importance. It dares you to analyze its stories and themes, as if to say, you're not gonna get me because I don't even get me. It doesn't help that multiple languages are used casually in the setting too. They really went out of their way to make this game as hard as possible to understand. Signalis wears that artsy badge as a sense of pride and refuses to let up. Keep that in mind when going into this game. It's a very cerebral plot that is meant to be open to interpretation, but it's still cool enough that you can simply enjoy the ride for the sights and sounds. A good comparison would be Suda51's older games like Killer 7, which also has a very strange story. You don't have to let yourself get caught up in all the deeper nonsense and you'll still have a good time, but if you are interested in digging deeper, there are a lot of references to real-life subjects scattered throughout the game, and you can certainly spend hours upon hours doing your research, connecting the dots, and discussing this game with others to formulate some semblance of meaning. You don't have to if you don't want to, you can still enjoy the story more casually, but the option is certainly there. The presentation is a bit all over the place, but it still manages to have a cohesive theme behind it, which is really impressive. The more detailed cutscenes are going for an anime look, However, the in-game graphics utilize a low polygon style with very few details that feels kind of dark and uncomfortable. Even the faces are totally blank with no facial expressions. The game jumps back and forth between these two approaches constantly, and while it can be very jarring, I'm sure that's also part of the point. One of the things I got out of it is that I feel like the game designers wanted the player to feel bad for having to kill a bunch of crazed androids that have lost control of their senses, not unlike a typical zombie story, and an effective way to do so might have been to draw all the characters as cute anime girls. It creates a rather startling juxtaposition that's effective but without being distracting. It's more likely though that the developers are just a couple of anime weebs, and I'm fine with that too. Much of the game is silent, with the music mainly coming in to warn the player of aggressive monsters or during select scenes. The silence and sound effects certainly helps give the game a very foreboding atmosphere, and it strengthens the dedicated music tracks when they are used. Now, this might have something to do with my nostalgia, but I do prefer the soundtracks in the Silent Hill and Resident Evil games. However, Signalis is no slouch either, and it has some good audio to it. It's a good sounding and great looking game, and the gameplay is solid too. It takes plenty of elements from both Resident Evil and Silent Hill to create something that works for it. The player has a very strict limit of 6 item spaces to carry on their person, although item boxes later on can be used for storage and retrieval. When an enemy is knocked down, running up close to kick their body will finish them off without spending any additional ammo. Similar to some of the Resident Evil games, once downed enemies can spring back up again and attack the player once more. There's no ink ribbons, but saving your game is unmistakably familiar in another way. Plenty of notes are scattered around for both hints and story details, and of course, much of Signalis is designed around cramped, almost claustrophobic rooms across several buildings. If you've played any of the older Resident Evil or Silent Hill games, then you've already got a good idea of what to expect. Signalis falls very much in line with both of those games. The only significant differences are the lack of tank controls, although this can be turned on in the options if you're a true purist, and more drastically, the top-down camera perspective really makes this game its own. Although, surprisingly, it still manages to feel very much like a traditional survival horror game. They really got that slow, methodical speed down just right with the usual aim and then fire type of controls. Signalis also does a great job in how it handles stealth. It does so in a somewhat similar way to how the Silent Hill games have attempted to implement stealth in the past, but while it wasn't all that impactful in Silent Hill, it actually works quite well in Signalis. Walking right by enemies and staying out of their line of sight can make for some pretty tense maneuvers, and it always feels good to skip combat and save up on that precious ammunition. You can do a weak push when enemies are up close, but otherwise there's not much in the way of melee weapons. There are consumable stun rods, but it doesn't amount to much due to factors that I'll get into later. For the most part, the combat revolves entirely around using guns and ammo. You do have a few weapons to choose from, although, again, it's not all that impactful. There is some minor enemy variety, faster enemies, sneaky enemies, enemies with shields, but for the most part, it's really not that big of a deal. So, on the surface, this sounds okay so far, but it's lacking in a lot of key ways. Much like Resident Evil, the game imparts upon you the importance of hoarding supplies, but in reality, you're rarely ever in danger of running low. Throughout my entire playthrough, I never used a stun rod, the hunting rifle, the submachine gun, or the flare gun one single time. And I only ever used the Magnum revolver for the final boss. For 90% of the game, I relied entirely on the pistol and shotgun with no real fear of running out of ammo, even on my first run through the game. So while there is quite a bit of weapon variety here, maybe even a little more than what's typical in a survival horror, doesn't really mean much because most of the weapons are unnecessary. I had a ton of healing items by the end too, and I rarely took damage anyway. I know that this stuff is kind of typical of the genre, and I haven't played the game on the highest difficulty for what that's worth, but I did find the game to be a touch too easy. While enemies can be resilient, it's not that hard to sneak around or run past them, and even if you do kill them and they end up getting back up later, it usually takes so long to happen that it almost doesn't matter. Two of the boss fights are pretty good, I'll give it that, even if they do rely on enemy reinforcements to keep it challenging, but it still works well for what they're going for. Other gameplay aspects that are popular in this genre are puzzles and exploration, and Signalis does a great job at both. The maps are easy to read, easy to navigate, and lend themselves well to at least a semblance of open-ended exploration. Key areas and locked doors are marked to help keep the player on track, but without holding their hand too much. As for the puzzles, some of them are the best I've seen in this entire genre. While one or two of them could have been a little more clear in my opinion, they're all very clever and take some real ingenuity to figure out, but without being so ridiculous that you'd need to look up the answer online. The game designers did a great job at striking that critical balance here. Unfortunately, there are also some extremely asinine design decisions at play. There are some items that need to be equipped in the secondary item slot, such as an automatic healing item and the stun rod. One of these items is a camera, and all it does is take a screenshot of what's currently on the game screen. It's so useless to the point of being insulting. Just take a regular screenshot, or you can take notes with a pen and paper, or take a photo with your smartphone. I wouldn't care so much, but taking screenshots is actually pretty useful in this game to solve some puzzles, and it's ridiculous that this eyeball camera takes up an inventory space just to use something that is so basic. Same goes for the flashlight, although in that case it's actually required in order to traverse many of the dark rooms in the game. Ironically, the dark rooms tend to have some of the more challenging encounters, where something like the stun rod might come in handy as a secondary weapon, but no, of course not. You can't equip the flashlight and the stun rod at the same time. This makes all the other sub-items nearly useless because it's so rare that you'll ever want to be without the flashlight. This could easily have been circumvented by making the eyeball camera and the flashlight permanent upgrades. It's strange because the radio doesn't take up any inventory space, so why couldn't these items fill a similar role? It's so obnoxious, and it's a design decision that just baffles me. Battling monsters can be pretty annoying too. If you get yourself caught in a bad corner, then you can be pretty easily stun locked to death. Obviously, you'll want to keep your enemies at a distance, but sometimes the auto-aim can act a little funky, and the way that the top-down camera is tilted at an angle can make it just a tad bit awkward to line up your shots. It takes a bit of getting used to, and it's really not so bad, but it still makes the game feel a little bit clunky. None of this is necessarily a deal breaker, but some of it, in particular the sub-items that I mentioned, are just bizarrely obnoxious. It's definitely worth noting that this game does not shy away from its inspirations in the slightest. I already mentioned the red graphic from saving your game, but you even start the game in a dilapidated restroom looking into a mirror, just like in Silent Hill 2. I feel like there's a little bit of Evangelion in there with how the game presents itself in general, as well as a couple of later scenes that I won't spoil, but they're lifted pretty directly from the first Silent Hill, and even from Ghost in the Shell of all things. Honestly, I appreciate it more than not that the game doesn't pretend or act like it's wholly original. It makes its influences very clear. I can see it being a little distracting for some people, but I feel like those moments are implemented well enough that they didn't take me out of the experience, and as a whole, Signalis is definitely more original than not. The last thing I want to say is that this game is extremely short. That is pretty common with this genre. The older Resident Evil games in particular are well known for being short, but it does feel particularly disappointing in this case. For me, part of it has to do with the ending. I was expecting something a little more grandiose and for certain side characters to get more involved, so I was surprised to see the game end as suddenly as it does. After discussing the game with a good friend of mine, I'm definitely a lot more understanding of why the game ends the way it does from a storytelling point of view, but I also feel like Signalis never manages to reach its full potential in terms of the gameplay. There's only about 3 major maps to explore and a few mini areas in between. Once you get to about the halfway point, you start to get a good idea of how the level design, enemy placement, and general gimmicks can make this game pretty special, but it never goes all out to truly test the player with its unique game mechanics. Signalis is extremely disappointing in that sense, not necessarily because I wanted more, but rather because it didn't feel like it was enough. Aside from some really stupid decisions with how certain items are prioritized, the weapon balancing being off, which is common for the genre, and how the game is just way too short, aside from all that, Signalis is still a very good game. The abundance of unsubtle references might be off-putting to some, and the insane plot will no doubt be confusing for most, but it's still well worth playing for anyone interested. I respect the developers for taking something as deep and insightful as the original Silent Hill trilogy and showing that they truly understand what made those games so special by going as far as making an original game themselves. I do wish that this was better overall, but I'm still pretty happy with what I've got. Thanks for watching my review on Signalis, and thanks to my good buddy One Doomed Game Critic for discussing the game with me and helping me formulate some ideas which helped me put together this review. If you're a fan of Silent Hill, I recommend that you check out his channel. He's got some great stuff on those games.